What's up, guys? I'm Chris Spags here, back with another Four Corners video breaking down today's NBA slate, courtesy of Awesemo.com. It seemed like enough people had a good night last night based on yesterday's video, so let's keep the momentum going. Like this video right now. Leave a comment down below. Tell me which player is your favorite on today's slate. Let's keep it going. Let's keep the conversation. Let's build this community up. So like the video right now and leave a comment. The first corner I want to hit on is a game with the Suns visiting the Rockets. This one is a 224.5 point combined total, which represents a 5.8 point boost for Houston and a 1.1 point drop for Phoenix. And with Chris Paul being out for rest, James Harden looks like a smash play today. He's going to get a lot more popular as the day goes on. He's averaged 1.78 fantasy points per minute so far this year without Chris Paul. He's had that monster run where everybody was playing him every night. It's a great success. His price is down from that monster run, so I'm going to be going to James Harden quite a bit. And if you're not playing James Harden tonight, you're probably going to have a lineup that's contrarian right away. Clint Capella gets a very, very slight boost per minute without Chris Paul on the floor, but I think we're going to see the bigger opportunity. There's a little more room for pick and rolls with James Harden, a spot where Capella's had his most success scoring. I think it's a nice spot for Clint Capella now that Chris Paul's been ruled out. Eric Gordon's going to see some extra shots as a result of CP3 being out. He has been very consistent with those extra shots in the past, so I don't really see a need to go to him, but I think some exposure probably does make sense. On the other side, Devin Booker interests me quite a bit at what looks like low ownership right now, under 5%. With Tyler Johnson ruled out, we could see a little more point book tonight, a little more time with the ball in his hands. Again, he's been more efficient recently. His usage hasn't been as high game to game, but I think this is a spot where we could see that usage spike. Very possible for Booker to have a game like Kemba Walker did the other day, which he just went nuts, had 67 fantasy points. I like the spot for Devin Booker quite a bit. Kelly Oubre is also an interesting option to me in game stacks. I could definitely see having him in lineups in which I have Harden and Capella and Booker. I like Oubre. I think he can spike an upside here. I think he's an interesting play. And DeAndre Ayton's price is down after disappointing as chalk, but he's cheap enough now where I think the 15% ownership expected for him seems more than fair. It's not the best matchup. It's going to be a slower paced game, and Capella is a very opposing guy on the other side, but I think a bounce back spot for DeAndre Ayton and not a ton of ownership makes sense to at least match there. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Blazers visiting the Pelicans. This one is a 234.5 point combined total, which is the highest on the slate. And that represents a 6.8 point boost for Portland and a 1.8 point drop for New Orleans. Yusuf Nurkic looks like the highest owned player in this game right now at 20% expected ownership. He's averaged 37.9 fantasy points versus New Orleans this year, which is a pretty good number. His salary is up a little bit, so it's not a perfect spot, but I think matching the field on him makes sense because he should have some upside given the pace up. CJ McCollum has had 21 and 24 shots and similarly paced up spots versus the Clippers and the Thunder. You also had a 53 fantasy point day versus the Clippers, not quite as good versus the Thunder, but I think the usage should be there for him. The fact he's been shooting more in pace ups, which would be expected, but he's been shooting more and it's been consistent. I think all looks good for CJ McCollum at a very reasonable price. It's a great spot for Damian Lillard with no Drew Holiday in the lineup. The question for Lillard is really whether he's going to push his usage up enough. He hasn't been willing to do that a lot recently, but when he does do that, he can spike a crazy high day. So I think Lillard's fair. At single-digit ownership, he does look good, but probably won't go a ton above that because of the players that we now know we have to get in, guys like Harden who are going to be a little more expensive. Al-Farouq Aminu has been over 33.5 fantasy points in both games versus the Pelicans this year. He was also comparably good versus them last year, so it could be a matchup situation. Could be something with where Nurkic is playing. Could give some more rebounding upside for Aminu and some shots as well from the corner, I think has benefited him as well. This is a spot to go to Aminu, but it still feels like it's not a spot I'd want to trust at high volume, but I think he has had enough success where he could just have the Pelicans number. Elfrid Payton's had over 51 fantasy points and triple doubles in his last two games. It feels unsustainable, but they have been pretty impressive performances overall, and the minutes have been there for him. So having some exposure to Elfrid Payton does make sense, while his price is still pretty reasonable. Julius Randle's had 4 straight games under 40 fantasy points, which is not good. His role's been there, but the rebounding hasn't, and he hasn't been showing as much upside there. I think if you see Elfrid Payton fail, you might see Randle do better, because where Randle's been missing out on rebounds, Elfrid Payton's been picking them up. So I think if Payton falters, you could see some of that trickle back to Randle. And Frank Jackson's been shooting between 18 and 20 times a game since Drew Holiday went out. That's a lot of shot attempts for a guy at his price. So he's in play for me. Darius Miller, also not a terrible value guy, but that's about all I would look at for the Pelicans. The next corner I want to hit on is a game with the Kings visiting the Sixers. This one has a 232 point combined total, which represents a 5.7 point boost for Philly and a 2.2 point drop for Sacramento. Joel Embiid's price is down, and this looks like a really strong spot for him at just 17% ownership. The Kings giving up a slate worst 48.7 rebounds per game. That checks out really well for Embiid. Also, she's going to give up a lot of shot attempts from deep to him. I don't think Willie Cauley-Stein can stay with him. I think Embiid is in a smash spot. He's a guy I'm going to want to get in more lineups than the ownership is currently dictating. This is a pace-up spot with poor rebounding, and that plays right into Ben Simmons' wheelhouse, so I like him here. The concern here is really the usage for Simmons now that we're going to have the full Sixers rotation available. Jimmy Butler's back after resting last game. It's the first time in a while where they've had all 4 guys ready to go. So that worries me a little bit, but I still think it's a nice spot for Simmons, and his price is still pretty reasonable. Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler are both in play, but I think Harris looks like the steadier play at less ownership. Butler could have some more upside. He did just rest as well, so that gave him some motivation, but his usage hasn't been there game to game enough, hasn't been totally engaged on the offensive side. I think that Harris looks like the better play at less ownership right now, but some exposure to Butler seems okay to me. JJ Redick's going to have less opportunity with all these guys back in the lineup, but he's going to see cleaner looks as a result, so he's in play. The Kings giving up a lot of 3-point attempts. JJ Redick can always heat up. Not a guy I'd want to go to at crazy volume, but I think he could have enough upside in a tournament. Buddy Hield got back on track versus Boston with a 52 fantasy point day. He's been shooting between 20 and 24 times a game. As long as the Kings are in this one, Buddy Hield's going to be shooting. Sixers defense is not that hospitable, but neither was the Celtics defense yesterday, so Buddy Hield, he can get it going in any matchup. I think he's an interesting play to go back to again today. It was a bit of a surprise last game as Nemanja Bjelica bumped Bogdan Bogdanovic out of the starting lineup, and it wasn't Marvin Bagley moving into the starting lineup, but Bjelica actually makes the situation a little better for Willie Cauley-Stein and for Harrison Barnes. So I think if we see Bjelica playing again, I don't mind going to Cauley-Stein and to Barnes here. Bjelica as well, maybe coming out a little more motivation versus Philly. It was a team who we signed a contract with and then reneged on. So it's a spot that's interesting for all those guys as long as the rotation stays the same. And because of their new roles, Bogdan and Marvin Bagley right now are pretty unplayable. Not getting enough minutes, not getting enough run to get there. De'Aaron Fox has been over 42 fantasy points in 3 straight games. He's also been over 47.25 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3, so that all looks good for De'Aaron Fox. I like what he's doing. I like how he's been looking recently. He's been showing a little more usage as well. He's in a good spot here, and he's a part of any game stacks I would make if this one does stay close. And the last corner I want to hit on is a game that we actually just hit on last Friday, the game with the Hornets visiting the Wizards. This one is a 232-point combined total, and it represents a 3.1 point boost for Washington and a 3.7 point boost for Charlotte. Bradley Beal's price is down, and he put up 41.5 fantasy points versus Charlotte in this matchup last Friday, the lowest of his recent hot run. He's not going to shoot 4 for 21 again like he did in that game. This is a really good spot for Bradley Beal to get back on track, and I like going above the field on his ownership right now. On the other hand, Tomas Satoransky's 21% ownership seems a little high for me. I think it's fine enough. He's a decent play, but with all the other guys that we have right now, I think we should see that number drop a little bit throughout the day. I like Tomas, but he's not really a guy I'm trying to get to today. Trevor Ariza is questionable with a sore knee right now, and his status is a key to watch because if he's ruled out, it's going to open up a lot more opportunity for Jeff Green and Jabari Parker on the wing. If he's ruled in, it's a good bounce back spot for Trevor Ariza. Shot just 1 for 6 with 5.25 fantasy points versus Orlando last game. That's not usually Trevor Ariza's output, but watch his status closer to lock. Bobby Portis put up 41.75 fantasy points in that game versus Charlotte last week, but the minutes are a concern. Thomas Bryant's been coming for him. He put up a double-double last game, which resulted in Bobby Portis getting less court time. So Portis is an okay play. I think I would have no problem putting him in lineups, but I would also want a little bit of coverage on Thomas Bryant just to be safe. Willie Hernangomez is projected to be the highest owned guy on the slate as of right now at 40% ownership. He got the minutes last game, and now it's a pace-up spot versus Washington, so I don't mind going back to him. There is some risk, though. They could go smaller with Frank Kaminsky if they end up needing more scoring, if, let's say, the Wizards pull ahead. You could also see Bismack Biyombo come in there if they think he's going to add value, let's say if Thomas Bryant gets going off the bench. So I think there's some risk with Willie, but where the ownership is and has a value play, it's hard really not to think about getting to him at close to that amount of ownership. Marvin Williams' 30% expected ownership seems pretty high after a 48.25 fantasy point day versus Washington last time. In my mind, he's not going to shoot 7 for 10 from deep. He's not going to put up 30 points again, so you're not going to see that much upside. I think Marvin Williams is still fine as a mid-tier guy who's close to value, but if you're expecting that much upside again, I think I would get a little bit underneath that ownership. Jeremy Lamb also had 50 fantasy points versus Washington last week, and I think he's got a better shot at having a comparable performance than Marvin Williams does. So I don't mind Jeremy Lamb today, but I think either way, I think the usage is going to flow away from those guys, but they're not going to have quite the ceilings they showed in that game versus Washington last Friday. Kemba Walker disappointed as a popular play in the spot last week, but he had a bounce back game versus Houston, 67.25 fantasy points where he showed that ceiling. I think it's a good spot to go back to Kemba Walker if people are going to be lower owned on him than they were last week. His price is still very low. He's got a ton of upside, and if his shot falls, he can really exceed value, same as he did versus Houston. Nick Batum's been about as steady as you can be with over 30 fantasy points and a very nice 6 out of his last 9 games. So he looks like a good play, a consistent play. I think I would trust him more than Marvin Williams, especially at much less ownership. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on today's 8-game NBA slate, and there are more in the link at the description down below. My column to Switch and Hedge on Awesemo.com talked about all the games in there, and there are a lot of interesting games on the slate, including the one with the Bulls and the Clippers. So check that link in the description right now. And please do like the video and leave a comment telling me your favorite play on today's slate on the way out. All the likes and comments help us out quite a bit. We're building a nice little community here every single day on this Four Corners video. So help us out, keep the momentum going, like the video, and leave a comment down below. Oh, and last but not least, check the promo code SWITCHANDHEDGE I'm putting right here. It'll give you 50% off your first month at Awesemo.com. All the ownership projections, which I reference in here, rankings from Awesemo, as well as projections from Josh Eggman, which you can plug right into Fantasy Crunch, are all at your fingertips. So check it out now. Use the promo code SWITCHANDHEDGE. And I'll be back again on Monday with another Four Corners video. So good luck.